Introduce you to a very, let's say, unusual presentation, which you might not have expected. But I'm always trying to bring in some form of art into the academic conferences. And this time we were so fortunate to be kind of approached by USC graduate student a year ago proposing to write poems on testimonies. He applied for one of our graduate student fellowships, and the proposal was kind of short, brief, not really like what we usually get from academics. So I thought, but I was intrigued, and we said, okay, we don't have a special fellowship for this, but we just give it a try. And so we invited Piotr, gave him an honorary fellowship, and he watched testimonies, and the product, the poem, he will now kind of present to you. Just to give you a little bit more feedback, insight about what Piotr is. So Piotr is originally from Poland. He is a poet, essayist, and also translates Polish poetry. His most recent books are East and West, a volume of poems from Lost Horse Press, and he did 2 volumes of translations, which is, I have to say, often undervalued work, but it's so important, and it's by itself an art, actually. So I think it's well kind of situated with him there. The volumes won awards, and in his real life, he is a doctoral candidate here at USC. So I welcome, and it's my distinct pleasure, Piotr Florczyk.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Wolf and Martha for having me. A couple more words in terms of the project itself. So 2 summers ago, I spent 2 weeks watching Shoah testimonies here on campus. And to begin with, I was completely overwhelmed with the number of testimonies. As you know, there are over 50, 60,000 of them. So I very quickly decided that I needed to concentrate on testimonies that had something to do with the city of Kraków, which is where I was born and raised. But that wasn't narrow enough. So I further narrowed it down to villages that are now part of the city, and also streets, districts within the city of Kraków. And I have created this 30-page long polyphonic work that is framed as a journey to Kraków. And there are 3 voices, if you will, or 3 speakers in the poems in terms of context. One is the voice of the survivors and their helpers, those who have survived and given testimony. Then there's the voice of the researcher here on campus staring at the computer screen and listening to these testimonies. And then there's the voice of a city tour guide who actually takes Piotr, the researcher, on the tour of these sites in Kraków and places adjacent to the city. So what you'll hear is me switching between tonalities and different voices, different perspectives. And these poems have no titles. There's one poem I'll read at the very end that has a title of its own, but otherwise it's just Roman numerals. Again, 30 pages of this, I'll read about 10 poems. 1. Full moon. 1, 2, 3, and more rusted cars bursting with flesh. The cold fire engine sending smoke signals across the plains. Each puff a breath in the sky, disappearing. Da-dum, da-dum. The tracks have always been here. My compartment mates, keeping their eyes closed, pretend to dream. A pond, a sketched out villa that was once a hut, a barn. Woods where a scared boy tries desperately to whistle a nursery rhyme on a blade of grass. This relic train for tourists is slow, but the arrival will be swift. These are the facts. The headlight, a scream swallowing itself. 8. The American poet Charles Reznikoff copied out fragments of the Nuremberg trials transcript to create his powerful Holocaust, a book of singular vision and horror. The tone and delivery, both flat, sneak up on you. The who, what, and when gets answered at the expense of the why, which too often gets answered with questions anyway. For my part, I've watched the testimonies for inspiration. Is that an evil thing? To be inspired at the same time as horrified? The tug-of-war didn't end when I closed out the browser, logged off, and took off the headphones. Back home, I delved into an album of Holocaust paintings by Wilhelm Sasnal, poring over his 2003 Shoah forest piece. The primordial wood in heavy, deliberate brushstrokes towers over 3 tiny figures. The greenery a dust storm, not foliage. Taking unhurried steps, the survivor is talking to Landsmann through a translator. Beyond the frame, off to the left, the villagers are talking directly to me. 3. One of the first testimonies I watched at the Shoah Foundation belongs to Clara. Her black-dyed hair and beaming smile. What does she see while spelling the town's name with her eyes shut? Each letter, a face, a house, a meal, a tree, a bend in the road, an end. That she and her brother and parents had once shared the southern Polish city with Piotr's grandparents is also a fact. 9. We was lucky. We was hungry. We go from this place away. We leave the house clean. Nothing left, not even a nail. Polish people give me a dog, happy dog. I had nothing, just walls. Then they give me couch. A nice man came. He tells me to run with what I have on my back. The skin, the blouse, unwashed in days. I didn't want to go to ghetto. I had a job, filling holes in roads. We danced when the Germans were shooting guns in the air. When we run from city to village for good, we was sad. Someone stole my dog. Then we saw one bird, another bird. We kept our armbands clean. 10. Once upon a time, an SS man took me away. He needed a translator. I spoke Polish and German. He took me to a farm, gave me a knife, and made me catch and kill a chicken for him. Afterwards, he took me back to my parents, thanking me for helping him out with his hunting affair. 5. Whose, if not mine, are these words? Listening is a form of speaking, viewed from another angle, the far corner of the room where the servers hum with the stories of survival. Piotr tells me he's heard it all, having guided group and private tours through these streets. Marching past the bars that stay open late, serving chilled vodka and pickles or herring, he learned how to build dugouts, forage for berries and roots, how the air tastes at night, when the mouths hidden underground all day come out. The room I worked in has become a story itself. The keyboard, the mouse, the screen in front of me. For every search word, either a place or name, an index of offshoots and tributaries. Kraków kept showing up on every map. The surrounding villages, Skała, Grębałów, Mogiła, or Węg, whose names mean something else to me, no less a constellation of what could have been if the day of the week were a Monday instead of a Wednesday, morning instead of evening. These words become mine the moment I let them go. 7. Piotr Polin was born in the 70s, in May. He told me as much as we crossed the intersection of Ditla and Starowiczna streets. He shares a birthday with the late John Paul II. Nobody in Poland forgets his birthday. A history major, he leaves no stone unturned. Wieliczka, Płaszów, Prokocim. Before he knew anything about the Jews, he went to summer camps on trains departing from Płaszów. When he broke both arms, having fallen off the window of an abandoned house whose walls were covered with the sweetest grapes, he ended up at the children's hospital in Prokocim. The doctors were nice to him. The beds and breathing machines bought with dollars. He says years later, when he mentioned to one American Jew that he'd been to the museum at Auschwitz numerous times, the man asked him if he enjoyed it so much that he couldn't get enough. Fucker. Those are the facts. From Starowiczna, we turned right onto Miodowa, Honey Street, then left on Szeroka. The Jewish festival ended yesterday. He asks if I'm hungry. 16. After touring Kazimierz, Piotr said we should go to Nowa Huta, east of the city center. When it was built in the late 40s, it gobbled up surrounding villages, including Czyżyny, today the location of an excellent airplane museum, in a park dedicated to Polish airmen who fought in World War II, first in Poland, then with the RAF in Britain. Piotr says he's never been to the museum, preferring unmediated historical touring. He wants to see and touch and feel things without glancing up at little plaques explaining things. Oral history, too, is his thing. When we arrive, having taken the Line 1 tram from Old Town to the sports and concert arena, we head north across the park, skirting the University School of Physical Education. But rather than the park itself or the museum, our destination is an old defunct airfield. The runway is disappearing under the onslaught of encroaching apartment blocks. When Piotr was a little boy, one could still see the concrete runway that divided the two housing estates named after Polish air squadrons. Many a kid learned how to ride a bike on the runway extended by slave laborers. I'm telling you how to get there so you can see it yourself before it disappears forever. 17. When is the weed high enough to hide in? Parting weed en route to freedom might attract suspicion. No wind can part the wheat the way a person in hiding can. The light of day troubled me. The why I was found out in a barn. Here, child, put on this hat. Its white brim will protect you. We, the uncircumcised, will take you in. 18. Auschwitz was better than Płaszów. We had more food there. I wouldn't lie about it. 19. Piotr remembers the day when Steven Spielberg's people came to his school looking for dark-haired children to star as extras in Schindler's List. While at the Shoah, I did a lot of Googling. That's how I found out that Eamon Guth's house in Płaszów, the one with the infamous balcony, still stands. 22. Lines upon lines at the railroad station in Kraków, behind the glass smudge full of starts and stops, a barn on fire, people and cars waiting at the crossing between nowhere and nowhere else. Imagine that. What could have been, was, is, time, and again taking on a head, followed by the finger tracing the rows and columns of letters, engines, carriages, at least one crying baby, and a suitcase falling off the wobbly rack above the sleepers, whose hands yo across the street, across the seat, about to clasp. And I'll close with a poem called Second Language. It's not part of the sequence, but it's part of the manuscript I'm working on. There are echoes of Gottfried Benn, Czesław Miłosz, T.S. Eliot, and other people in here that you'll probably recognize. Second Language. It's rained for so long that I haven't left the couch in days. Poets sprawl across me, predicting the world's end. Will it come with a bang or tomatoes ripening on the vine? Feeble-hearted Chopin practices his funeral march with a small hand. My next-door neighbors, dinner time, don't mind the rain or that our initials disappear from the curb. After reading Mouse, I look in a mirror and see a pig made in art's image. Then I read it again, backwards, but the same frayed speech bubbles hover over my head. The pit of smoldering questions grows deeper. Years ago, in Warsaw, I went to see that heart. Stowed away inside the first pillar on the left, it is what keeps the world from falling apart. Thank you. Questions? Are we have questions now?
We have a little of time.
Okay.
Just wondering about the perpetrator, and in your thinking about this cycle, why you chose not to inhabit the perpetrator.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I don't have an answer for you. I mean, I think what I was getting after is there's plenty of perpetrators in some of the other poems I chose not to share today. There are in there, definitely. But ultimately, I think, I keep sort of thinking back to why I had proposed this project to the foundation, and I think I wanted to immerse myself in the historical facts, basically, that had been hidden for much of my childhood. As you probably know, a lot of these stories of Holocaust stories were not out in the open back in Poland, back in the day when I was a kid there, when I was, in the 70s and 80s. And I wanted to rectify that, if only for myself, rather than, for other people, or creating this massive thing that would maybe be used as a historical document of some sort. Popular historian, I think that was one of the terms that came up during the panels earlier today. And I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in coming to terms myself with what happened, why it wasn't talked about when I was a kid, and perhaps more importantly, what's become of those sites in Poland, in Kraków especially, because they're still there for the most part. Houses, streets, places, that I'm familiar with, because when I was a kid, I went to school not far from, a monastery, for instance, where a couple of the survivors had hidden in the war. But the perpetrators are in there, are in the sequence. Yes.
How do you think listening and viewing the testimonies, as opposed to, say, reading a transcript and working with the written word, changed this poem? I know with my work personally, I've switched over from reading to viewing Holocaust testimony. I've been struck by the similarities in phrasing, but also the differences of the openness. I feel when they talk, they can go different places. So how do you think that viewing instead of reading, being a poet, affected the poem?
Yeah, thank you. One of the more interesting experiences for me was listening to the testimonies that were, by and large, given by Polish Jews, not in Poland. I think 90% of the testimonies were recorded in New York and South Africa and Australia. And I don't mean to discount the actual stories of survival, what people had to do in order to survive, but as a poet, and a translator, I was really interested in the way that people spoke, which is why I chose to share one of those poems with you in sort of broken English, where the subject-verb argument isn't really there, because many of those survivors spoke in that kind of English. And it was really fascinating to sort of listen to them, but at the same time try to understand them, and also maybe think in between the lines, where is it that they're not saying? Because they cannot express themselves in their probably third or fourth language. But I think what kept bringing me back, and what I kept getting out of this was, every time there was a mentioning of a site in Poland, in Kraków, or a street, I would immediately think of my own connection to that place and use their words to sort of populate the landscape for myself and imagine it, or reimagine it, or remember it for myself. Yeah. Well, thank you.